Thank you. And please remember to put your questions into the chat box, and I will be monitoring that. So let me welcome everybody, to those in Cambridge, as well as those joining us from all parts of the world. After an amazing event yesterday, where we heard insights from Freire's work from Professora Ana Maria Saúl and Professor Carlos Alberto Torres, we continue today with our celebrations to mark the centenary of Freire's work, of Freire's birth. I first want to acknowledge the work of CLAREC, the Cambridge Latin American Research in Education Collective, and thank them for leading us with this important event and all their very hard work that they have done. And I want to thank also Holly and Sandra for the work that they've done in the background to get everything ready here for this Real Center CLAREC seminar. Thank you to all other institutions who are involved, particularly those friends in Brazil, for enabling spaces to share Freire's knowledge. To all of you students, early career researchers, practitioners, academics, and everybody else joining us, thank you for being here. Yesterday, Professor Susan Robertson, the head of the Faculty of Education, culminated the event by asking our speakers if Freire is still relevant in the 21st century. And there was no hesitation in the responses from Professora Saúl and Professor Torres. Freire continues to influence our thinking and approach, particularly with the challenges that we will face in the years ahead. And one of our greatest challenges is climate change, and very relevant to COP26. So there are generations of learners that require to think critically and take immediate action to combat the climate emergency. And it is for this reason that I am absolutely honored to introduce you to our key speaker today, Dr. Gabriela Martinez Sainz. Gabriela is an assistant professor in education at University College Dublin. Her research focuses on children's rights, global citizenship, and education for sustainable development. She is an old friend of Cambridge, a place where she completed her MPhil and a PhD. And I can see that we have many faces here who are good friends of Gabi, who are now joining us. So I will now open the floor and let Gabriela share with us one of her latest research on climate change education, where she brings Freirean thought into action. Gabi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. Boa tarde a todos. Hi from Dublin to many different places. I can see already in the chat that we have even people joining us from COP, which is fantastic, COP26. Just echoing Ricardo's words, I wanted to thank first and foremost to the Real Center, the Research for Equitable Access and Learning Center at the faculty, but also to CLAREC, to the Cambridge Latin American Research in Education Collective for this fantastic event that they're putting together and for inviting me to participate in this centenary of Paulo Freire and to celebrate his legacy across different areas of education. As Ricardo mentioned, I completed my PhD many years ago in the Faculty of Education, so it's always a pleasure for me to come back, even if it's in a remote and virtual way. I will now share with you my screen. And after almost 2 years in the pandemic, you would assume everything works out, but if not, if you stop watching the screen or something happens, please just let me know. As world leaders, policymakers, activists, representatives of industry, and many other people are joining now at COP26, I think it seems particularly relevant for us to discuss what the role of education is as one of the strategic actions we should be taking to address the climate crisis. COP and these kind of global events are good reminders of why we need to talk about climate change education as one of the strategic actions, but also to help us, practitioners, researchers, teachers, educators across the world to rethink our assumptions and our practices when it comes to how we address the changing climate through our teaching and learning strategies. Climate change is without any doubt one of the most pressing crises of our time, but unlike other crises, we haven't figured out, or we haven't wanted to figure out yet, what exactly we're going to do to tackle it. If you think about, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals that have very concrete and actionable targets for issues such as health, poverty, or education, when it comes to climate action, it's quite vague and broad, and basically it just says, yeah, we should do something about the climate crisis. So that's what differentiates climate crisis from the pandemic, from many other crises at the moment, that the strategic actions that we should be aiming towards are not entirely decided yet. If you have been following, for example, news from COP26, you might be aware that many countries are now putting forward their commitments, saying kind of how they're going to do at the national level some of the commitments they have agreed at the international arena. But even though everyone is admitting the need for the reduction on carbon emissions, none of the countries is actually committing to radical targets that could be needed to actually keep global warming within the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit. And I think this matters particularly to international development and those of us who work in education, in the intersection between education and international development, because as we know, the countries in the global south that are the home of the most affected individual communities and collectives are the ones impacted the most by the climate crisis. I think it was striking when yesterday, Mia Amor-Motley, the Barbados Prime Minister, for example, in her address put it quite boldly that while 1.5 is the limit usually discussed, and many countries in the global north toy with the idea of, well, but we can reach until 2 degrees and that will be fine. For her, for Barbados, 1.5 limit, and I'm quoting, is what we need to survive. And 2 degrees Celsius is a death sentence. So all of us, we have experienced both, and you will see in the presentation, in the global north and in the global south, we are experiencing extreme weather events. We are experiencing the impacts of the climate crisis, but we're not experiencing in the same way. And those of us who are working on international development and education should be trying to figure out what is the role, what is our role, our responsibility in tackling the climate crisis. So the role of education is highly regarded. Everyone kind of agrees that it's important that we teach and learn about the climate crisis, but there's very limited evidence on impact, especially in long term, about climate change initiatives. These tend to be very local. We don't have loads of studies that actually address what we are looking at when we look at the landscape of climate change education, because we have loads of things happening at the same time. And then that means we have limited and insufficient data and evidence to respond to the challenge of what climate change education should be doing. And that's where we are. This is the big problem. But I don't want to forget that we're here also to celebrate the legacy of Paulo Freire on his centenary, the 100th anniversary of Paulo Freire. So the question I posed for these research seminars was exactly what's the value of Freire's ideas for today's crisis when we talk about the climate, how these ideas can contribute to anything to rethink the climate change education, and what lessons we can learn from his ideas that are relevant in international development and education. Just as a bit of background, the framework I'm presenting today comes from chapter, I work with my colleague, Rowan Oberman from Dublin City University. Rowan and I were invited last year to contribute to an edited volume that was looking at intersections between social justice education and education for sustainable development. But the idea was to look at the intersection into detail and how it applies in school curriculum at primary level. So if you're interested in primary education, social justice education, or sustainable development, I highly recommend the volume. The editors did an amazing work putting it together. But Rowan and I were specifically asked to think about climate change education and what intersection of social justice, sustainable development, and climate change education would look like in practice. And when we were discussing the kind of framework we would need to support this critical, participatory, and socially just approach that we wanted for climate change education in the primary curriculum, we inevitably came back to Freire's ideas of pedagogy, of education, of problem-posing education, and so on. In particularly, we focus on two of the main concepts in Freire's proposal, and that is conscientização, or critical consciousness. I apologize with our friends in Brazil. My Portuñol has always been very questionable. So I'm going to use critical consciousness throughout the seminar just to avoid mispronouncing conscientização. Yes, so we use two concepts, critical consciousness and praxis, to actually develop a framework that help us make these connections between social justice, sustainable development, and climate change education. And this is a background, this is where the framework comes from. But for this talk, what I wanted to focus is on the why and how beyond primary education. So I want to provide a stronger justification of why we think Freire is a suitable, Freire's ideas are suitable when thinking about teaching and learning for the changing climate. And I also want to focus on the how, and I will do that by looking at particular examples of what will be considered good practices from the Global South to make a stronger case for this justification. What's so special about Freire's proposal that 100 years after he was born, we're here still discussing them and engaging with them, rereading over and over again? Why after over 50 years since Pedagogy of the Press was published, we still go back to this text and find it suitable for such difficult questions in education today? And I think these two concepts hold a big key in understanding the usefulness, and I don't mean that in the instrumentalist way, but an actual relevance of Freire's work in today's crisis. So I'm going to start with the why, and that's the framework to think about this. As many of you probably already know, critical consciousness in Freire is understood as this awakening process, as becoming aware through a problem-posing education, through a completely different approach to education, to the oppressive systems in our reality, to being aware of the dominant discourses, power relations, and historical legacies of injustices and struggles that in a way rule and structure our everyday lives and experiences. However, critical consciousness is not just the awakening or the awareness process. It's also about understanding that this is a process and that there's room to actually transform that reality, to transform those oppressive systems, to challenge the dominant discourses, to transform the power relations, and do something to restore the historical legacies of injustices and struggles. So it's not just knowing, it's knowing and understanding that we can transform reality, because it's not a static process, It's not a static product, it is a process in constant change. Critical consciousness depends on and leads to praxis, which is a critical intervention. That means we actually act on the world as a result of the merging consciousness that we develop. It's a deep reflection with a strong commitment to transformative actions. So praxis is this symbiosis between action and reflection upon the world, and not the world as this abstract view of reality, but our concrete, contextual, and individual world, what is happening around us, what injustices we face, what challenges we are looking at in our everyday experiences. So in Freire, reflection is not separated from action. So when we think critically about our reality, in this case, when we think critically, for example, about the climate crisis, about how it's impacting us, how it's impacting communities, we acknowledge that action and reflection are completely intertwined. And when we take action to transform, we can't do that without the reflection and without engaging in a kind of continuous cycle of reflection and action. So the essence of this interaction, of these critical interventions that we conduct because of critical consciousness and practice, means that we're being in the world to transform the world. And I think that's key for climate change education. And here's where I'm going to talk a little bit more about the robustness of the why, and that is what is the added value of using this framework from Freire's concepts of critical consciousness and practice. So if we problematize the world to enable action upon it, what changes for climate change education? Well, first, it allows us to think and address climate change as a socio-scientific issue, acknowledge that it has a nature that it's socio-scientific, not just scientific, and also address the complexities of the crisis that results from it. That means that when teaching and learning about the climate, we realize not only the natural processes, the scientific facts involved, we don't only understand how, for example, we were able to identify social, political, and economic factors and implications. We understand how political and economic motivations drive different decisions when it comes to the climate. We understand the economics behind the climate crisis. We understand the geopolitics behind the climate crisis, but we're also aware that it's not just a matter of greenhouse emissions. It's a matter that we have to address when teaching about it, about the implications for the global south, for communities, implications about the finances around climate change, for example, that we make the connections about actions and what actions in the different spectrum of political participation can actually yield more results when discussing climate change. The distinction between collective and individual actions, structural and individual actions, that's only possible if we have these, if we actually address fully the socio-scientific nature of climate change. And it's not possible to do it without critical pedagogical approach. Because in the last decade, we have seen a shift in climate change education. For the very first time in the 90s, when the IPCC reports started to emerge, the focus of climate change education was very much on getting people to understand the facts. So helping individuals and communities, children, even policymakers to understand the science behind climate change. However, in the last couple of years, we have seen a shift, and that can also be mapped in the language, for example, of the IPCC reports, that it's no longer just about the facts And I think in this way, this mirrors very much other crises like the coronavirus crisis, the pandemic crisis, that it's not just about teaching and learning facts and scientific issues around climate change. It's a comprehension, like a broader comprehension of the full crisis and what it impacts, what are the impacts and what it implies for different stakeholders and what actions then are needed. So that's the first clear advantage that I think critical pedagogy brings to climate change education. And the other one is precisely the emphasis, Freire's emphasis on transformation as the educational goal. This action-driven approach to teaching and learning can do what till this moment we haven't done when we think about climate action, and it's thinking about specific measures, specific targets we need to achieve to make this happen. Because the educational goal is to transform, not only to understand the climate crisis, but to actually transform, mitigate, adapt, conduct risk assessments, do the actual things that need to be done to contain and address the climate crisis. And I say both because we know that many of the impacts that we have already triggered some of the tipping points. So at this point, climate action has to be both about mitigation and adaptation. So the point of teaching the science, economic, or social impacts is to transform reality, to influence geopolitics, for example, to foster in children an interest in nature, how to protect it, and so on. So it's a wide array of actions that can be taken, but the core principle is to transform reality. And by actions, I mean both the positive and the negative. And I think for this, also Freire's understanding of the power of education is quite useful. Because on one hand, it's about positive action. It's about empowering individuals. It's about promoting and fostering agency among individuals and communities. But also it's about literacy and persuasion. And we know Freire's work focused primarily on adult literacy, but I want this opportunity of rethinking his work for the climate crisis to propose that we now think Freire's work as a proposal on world literacy. And if that's the case in climate change education, that means Freire can help us to develop multiple literacies that we need today to understand the climate crisis: legal literacy, political literacy, economic literacy, and so on. And that will help us to fight and persuade, tackle some of the sources of inaction that we know today affect the climate crisis and the climate agenda, from deflection, delay, dismissal, disinformation, doomism, and so on. So the transformation comes from the positive as well as the negative part of action. Because if our educational goal is to transform the world, then Freire's proposal has three concrete benefits. It helps us to develop political educational actions. And I appreciate the discussion yesterday with one of my dear colleagues, Dr. Daniel Capistrano. He's from Brazil, and we were going back and forth on how to better translate the idea of Freire of political pedagogical actions, because we know and we assume that education is political, but Freire puts the politics at the core of what we do when we teach and at the core of what we do when we learn. It emphasizes the importance of collective actions, but also responsive actions, actions that come from the context that we live in and that benefit and transform that particular context. So I'm going to use these three advantages to map three examples, by no means these examples are everything that's happening in the Global South. On the contrary, I think one of the things that would have to happen, and that I will leave that as a provocation for the questions and answers later on, is that we should start looking at what's happening in the Global South, because they are already dealing with adaptation to climate change events, to extreme weather events. They are already experiencing it. So for them, it's not a discussion of what we're going to do in 2030 or how neutral we're going to become in 2050. It's a reality they're facing today. So the first example comes from Mexico, and this is the collective of women, and sorry for the typo. I was writing in both Spanish and English, and these things happen. The collective San Pedro y San Pablo de Ayutla from Mexico. These are women coming together to fight access to water in their community. They were, their lands were taken, and I'm not going into the political complexities of how that happened or who is responsible. Their lands were taken, and access to the water they have in their community was limited. So for the last 3 years, they've been fighting through the legal system for the state to take action and to protect their communities and to guarantee the right to access water. Not only for them, climate change education, it's something that they need to. They realized it was their only hope to actually get their land back. And for them, climate change education looks very much as legal literacy, knowing how to navigate the legal system, how to demand from the state specific actions, how to engage with other stakeholders, because education is political. And climate change education is political. And if we don't start acknowledge and working on that, we're not any better than countries at COP26, just agreeing with the importance without actually committing to the hard part that is making the political commitments to do it. So in this case, climate change is political, climate change education is political and demands, as a result, political educational actions. The other example I want to bring out is from a lab community forest. They are in the Himalayas, and their mission, this is an organization, their mission is to restore the native forest. And it's important to do reforestation in a way that actually acknowledges the native species. It makes it more efficient, but also it gives more alternatives and opportunities for the communities involved. And they have they have 2 different programs, for example, community training and climate action fellows. And they work within the 4 communities to actually transfer knowledge between each other, transfer knowledge between the native communities, what they know about the soil, for example, what they know about the types of trees and plants and how to take care of them, so the other communities gain knowledge. And for me, this is a great example of collective action. It's so often we talk about collective action in climate change education as activism, as political action, and I think it's undeniably true. But in the Global South, this type of collective action is what's taking place, because it's what they need to actually make a change. It's not just about demanding politicians or policymakers to take things seriously. It's actually working together in communities to do something. And the final example that I wanted to bring, and this comes back to the idea of responsiveness and responsive actions, is the new school curriculum in St. Vincent and the Grenadines that has been developed as a bridge between formal and informal education, between what happens in the school and what happens in the communities. So different NGOs, for example, now come together and have initiatives. One of them, for example, Susgren, where these photos are taken from, they organize and help school children, secondary school children, to become stewards and advocates for marine environment. But rather than do it as a separate initiative, it comes very much from the context of St. Vincent. That is what the children are experiencing every day. But then it links to specific topics within the curriculum. So children experience that whatever they learn in the school and whatever they experience in their everyday lives about climate change is actually connected, and then what they envision are the actions they need to take moving forward are not just a school project or something that I do as an extracurricular activity, but it's about their lives. And I think this is a very much in the Freirean spirit of being in the world to transform the world. So as provocations, because I promised that I will finish with some provocations for those of us who are either in education or international development, in teaching, in politics, or in a little bit of all of them at the moment. Where we go from here and what do we do now? And instead of me giving answers, I'm just posing questions. What should we do now? If Freire is actually giving us the answer, what does that mean for educators? What does that mean for the international development agenda? What do we have to do to rethink some of the educational interventions we are putting forward right now? And I will leave you with the words from yesterday. This is from yesterday's speeches from Brianna from Samoa, saying that those in the global south, those in the Pacific, they're not drowning, they are fighting. So I think when we think about the global south and the climate crisis, of course they are the most affected, but we are not supposed to look at this in a condescending way. I think we're supposed to look at them and learn from them how they are actually transforming the world, so we can do with both reflection and action a global critical consciousness about what we should do from now on. So I'll stop talking. I think I kept in time, Ricardo, so.
Thank you, Gabby. Thank you very much for this amazing presentation, for the insights, and also for bringing the global south at the forefront of what action should be. I think sometimes in the global north, we sit quite comfortable in where we are, and we don't see the consequences of climate change in the way that they're really seen, perceived, and actually done by people in the global south. So thank you very much for giving us this presentation. And I have some comments here and some questions that are starting to emerge in the chat. And colleagues, if that's okay, I will read them rather than asking individuals to come in, because we have a very large group, and I'm very pleased and excited that you're joining us from several parts of the world. So we have one question that is from Dr. Ali Asgor, asking, are the initiatives in the global south, were they inspired by Freire's work? Or
not all of them. Well, clearly, for example, the collective from Mexico, they rarely even name their what they do and how they teach other women, for example, in the collective, and how they have these workshops on what they're going to do now with their legal case and so on. They barely label it as climate change education, even though it's undeniable climate change education. So let alone, I don't think they are necessarily using Freire's work. I do think, for example, the St. Vincent and the Grenadines curriculum and the researchers involved have been working with Freire's ideas before, so it's probably not completely based on, but definitely inspired by some of the work by Freire. I do believe that it's actually making these connections when we look at work that was not, or it's not explicitly inspired by, but where we recognize Freire's ideas and Freire's contributions in those projects. that we can understand the scope of influence that his legacy has had. So I don't think they are directly inspired, but at least one of them is indirectly, and the connections are made by myself. So
Thank you. And I think it aligns well with what the speakers yesterday were saying, that we are here to learn from Freire, not to just use Freire, but to continue to move Freire's work ahead, and to go deeper into Freire's rather than just to use it word by word. We have another question that is from the current curriculum being one of the causes of the crisis, and I think you have engaged with issues to do with the curriculum. And the question by Barku Arik is saying how do you integrate climate change education into the existing curriculum, where the curriculum is based on growth, the growth-based economy. So what do you think about this? And if you have any thoughts from your work.
It's an interesting one, and we were actually discussing in a session in one of our models in UCD a couple of weeks ago, what happens when we know that some of the actions that we need to take are very political, are anti-capitalist actions, are defying the idea of economic growth, are rethinking what prosperity actually looks like, and so on. And what I think, and this is my personal view, it's that we can't expect, I think it will be very naive of us to expect that national curriculums will give us a more radical solution, because it's not within the realm of national curriculums or textbooks or teacher education to advocate for this radical change. It should in perhaps an ideal world, but I don't think it will happen anytime soon. So that's why, and for example, the example from St. Vincent and the Grenadines, it's so important, because it shows that probably what we need to do is to link and bring together non-formal and formal education to actually come up with more radical solutions. Otherwise, it won't happen.
Thank you. And our colleague Raul Valdivia, who we've been engaged in the reading group of Freire, if you have seen some of the additional activities that Clarek is doing, is the reading group. So it's just fantastic to be in the part of the Spanish reading group. We have the Portuguese reading group and also the English reading group. So thank you, Raul, for posing this question. And the question is, how do you see the role of indigenous knowledges, Gabby, from the Global South in climate change education? And specifically, Raul is saying that it seems to him that scientific knowledge alone hasn't been very successful. His question is whether you're aware of studies that show the contribution of indigenous knowledges, and whether these are embedded in the curriculum in shaping people's aptitudes, behaviors, values with respect to climate change. And he's finishing with a gracias. Thank you, Raul. Gabby, over to you.
Thank you. I think this is a really important point. I completely agree. Scientific knowledge, as we understand in this very Western-centric global North idea of scientific knowledge, it's not enough, and we see it every day. It's not enough. The persuasion needed, the more deep analysis needed, and actions needed can't emerge just from scientific reports or IPCC reports about the climate change, the climate crisis. I do, however, think there's a bit of a gap between what's happening in indigenous communities when it comes to climate, addressing the climate crisis, and what we know about what they do to address the climate crisis. And that gap, we know the reasons for that gap. It's difficult to research, then it's difficult to publish. There are language barriers. There are assumptions of what valid publication of those results looks like, when for many indigenous communities, the dissemination of the results, it's the less important thing. What they want to do is actually strengthen the knowledge of their communities and so on. So that's an important gap. I cannot think of any specific issues, of any specific publications, but I will look into it. And if you follow up with me, I think this is a particular interesting gap that we should be looking at.
Thank you. And you have another question from Darren McDermott. He's thanking you for your presentation and making him reread Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which many colleagues here are agreeing with that. And that's partly what we're doing here during these 2 weeks. So the question is whether you see the internationalization of higher education as being a catalyst for more informed critical consciousness in climate change education.
Darren, I hope so. I actually hope so, because that might be the way to take the more instrumentalist view of internationalization and actually use it as a vehicle for building a global community. One of the issues we often have with the internationalization agenda is that it feels very much a corporate agenda of bringing international students from the global south to the global north to learn how to do things. And that is very problematic. And for years, I think it's been in the discussions. So it perhaps Freire is the answer as well to rethinking what we mean when we mean internationalize higher education, and why it's not in both directions. So why students from the global north, for example, are not learning from the global south, why they're not going to global south institutions to learn more, why we can't access knowledge of indigenous communities as we were just mentioning a couple of minutes ago, and so on. So probably it's a good framework to also think of a global critical consciousness as a result of internationalization.
Thank you, Darren. And it also made me think about learning to de-learn, or to take away the learning that is not the right learning. And here we are as pretty much colleagues from the global south in the global north institutions who have actually made trips and contributed to the climate crisis that we have, and now having to rethink and reinvent and rechange. So thank you for your question. Luis Carlos Leal is asking you whether climate and its effects should become a school discipline.
That's quite interesting. I know people that have very opposite views, even people that share a common concern about social justice education, for example, or education for sustainable development. The arguments in favor of is that it will provide a specific space in the curriculum to actually teach and learn about the processes, scientific facts, implications, and so on. And the contra argument is that for that to happen, it will just take so long to actually create the curricular spaces for the climate crisis. It will take so much time that we don't have to actually teach and learn about the crisis. So the proposal is to have a more transversal approach to a curriculum. So use geography, use the spaces we already have, like geography, science, maths, social studies, to work on teaching and learning about the crisis now, rather than expecting it to have a space for it. As well, I think it also depends on the context, and this comes back to the idea of being responsive for a place like St. Vincent and the Grenadines, because they are experiencing the effects of climate crisis so much in their everyday lives. It actually makes sense to have a curriculum around climate change. So it's not just a subject. In St. Vincent, it's the whole curriculum has a climate change adaptation and mitigation, as well as risk reduction of risk approach. I won't take any sides. I will just say that it would probably need to be based on each specific context, but those are the arguments and contra-arguments that I know of when it comes to giving it a special curricular space.
Thank you. I'm going to put together these two questions, and thank you for continue to put your questions. And I think they're together because they kind of relate to each other. So the first one is from Vicky, who is asking whether is it better to focus on compassionate values rather than specific aspects of environmental education. So what she's following on is with the issue that knowledge and skills won't be acted upon if attitudes are not appropriate. And let me just follow with the following one, which comes from Laila Gaudzencio. And Laila is asking that is curious to hear more about the specific methodologies used in practical settings with local communities. Is saying I've worked in a university extension project on urban river restoration in Belo Horizonte in Brazil, and the most difficult aspect we had was working with the community's relationship with the river and the rooted understanding that progress was canalization and not revitalization. So my perception is that a general public engagement on the environment is rather difficult compared to other issues. So I think they're kind of interconnected in a way in which they're asking for some of your reflections about probably knowledge, working with communities, and the role of Freire's work on this.
And it's undeniable that without attitudes, as we were saying, scientific knowledge on itself won't lead us that far. How do we change those attitudes? I think there are different answers. Personally, I don't think we should take out, because we have seen this before. We have seen this, for example, in human rights. When we say, no, we shouldn't focus on the legal aspect of human rights. We should just focus on the attitudes towards right and look about empathy and compassion, and that is the answer. And what I feel would happen if you take out the knowledge and skills is that you end up with a very diluted kind of education, that it's more about moral education, more about being good individuals, being good citizens of the world, rather than a full, powerful education that gives you the knowledge, the legal knowledge, the political literacy, once you have developed the attitudes, to put your skills into action to enact change. So I would be very hesitant to just say, even though it's undeniably about the attitudes and how you foster those attitudes, and loads of initiatives from empathy and socio-emotional learning, for example, can inform climate change education to actually do it, to do the persuasive work needed. I would be very hesitant to take out the environmental, scientific knowledge, as well as the legal, political, and economic skills needed to actually transform the world. And linking that to what Lila was mentioning, perhaps one of the most important challenges in today's climate change education is not making sense of the facts, is persuading people. And it's incredible, because when you have the first-hand experiences of extreme weather events, where you have the testimonials of individuals fighting climate crisis over and over again, and as you were saying, even the communities that are suffering and will suffer from the climate crisis, breaking